but that's the way we've always done it. Hey, I am Chuck the Bureaucrat, and in the world of change management, or more precisely policy reform, there are two similar yet competing sentiments. These are, that's the way we've always done it, and the status quo is not an option. Now, I say opposing because it should be obvious that neither of these points of view admit the other as a serious alternative. What most people overlook is the similarity between those two positions. That is, both points of view reflect an opinion about current policy that is not entirely informed. For the "that's the way we've always done it" crowd, they tend to be unable to explain why that's the way it's done. And for the status quo is not an option people, they tend to overlook the fact that the status quo was the best alternative of all options available the last time this was considered. The status quo is the reigning world heavyweight champion, so of course it's an option, and probably a pretty good one. So to dig into this, let's look at a little parable from 1929 and at a real-world example that might just come back to bite reserve component soldiers in the ankle in a couple of years. First, the parable of Chesterton's fence. Gilbert Chesterton was an English philosopher, and in 1929 he published a principle, some might call it a paradox, that has come to be known as Chesterton's fence. He said, suppose there's a certain law or policy, and just for the sake of simplicity, let's imagine that that law is a fence with a gate that blocks a road. There's a certain kind of reformer who walks up to that gate and says, I don't see a reason for this fence. Let's just clear it away. A more thoughtful reformer would say, I don't see why this fence is here, but until I do, I don't know it's safe to knock it down. See, it takes a lot of effort to build a fence, so it's safe to assume that there was a reason that the fence was built in the first place. The same goes for bureaucratic activity. I mean, sure, throwing up delaying tactics is something you'll get from bureaucrats, but when you see a group of bureaucrats sweatily slaving away on some process, you can be sure that something somehow is making them do that work. So before you stop them, figure out why they're laboring away. Now, let me give you a real-world example of this principle of Chesterton's fence in action. Back in 2010, I was working reserve manpower. And without getting too far into the details, there's a particular form of active duty that a reserve component soldier can do called ADOS, Active Duty Operational Support. Technically, this is defined in Title 10, Section 12301, subparagraph D. You might imagine that back in 2010, there was a lot of money to place reserve soldiers on these kinds of orders, and these orders were fairly popular. It was essentially like putting reserve component soldiers on active duty. But these orders came with a catch that was called the 1095 rule. Section 115 of Title 10 said that if a reserve component soldier was on this type of order for more than 1,095 days in a 1,460-day period, that they counted against regular Army strength. By the way, those numbers are 3 years in a 4-year period. So the 1095 rule is our Chesterton fence. The 1095 rule was widely communicated, but in many cases, people didn't know why it applied. There would just be some reference in a local SOP with no reference back to the fact that Congress set this rule. And you can imagine the hue and the cry between the "that's the way we've always done it" and the "status quo is not an option" crowds. It turns out that that's the way we've always done it because that's the way that Congress wanted it done. But that doesn't mean that that's the way we've always done it is always the right answer. In fact, that's why I picked the example of the 1095 rule. In the 2022 National Defense Authorization Act, Congress changed Section 115 of Title 10. They replaced the 1095 rule with a new rule that a reserve component soldier could be on active duty for 1,825 days in a 290-day period. That's 5 years in a 6-year period. But here's the interesting thing. Army Regulation 135-200 that governs ADOS orders, it was last updated in 2020. It still refers to the 1095 rule. So, while back in 2010, 1095 was the rule because Congress said it was the rule, today it is quite literally an obsolete status quo. I do hesitate to say that the status quo is not an option because technically, if you follow the old rule, you will comply with the new rule. But regardless, Chesterton's fence remains valid. As a good Pentagon bureaucrat, your job is to understand why the status quo exists. From there, you can help our leaders make much better decisions. And if you want another colloquialism that merits taking the time to understand, watch this video on the color of money.